stood on that snow-covered pass where 9 souls met their fate, I felt something wrong, like the mountain itself was watching me. The cold wasn't just cold, it felt alive, clawing through my layers of clothing, biting into my skin and settling deep into my bones. The wind howled through the void like a wounded animal, carrying faint, distant whispers. The Ural Mountains are unforgiving. They stretch endlessly, blanketed in white, swallowing sound and light alike. But here, on this spot, there's something different. A stillness. A silence so heavy it feels suffocating. You can read about the Dyatlov Pass Incident anywhere. Textbooks, conspiracy forums, late-night documentaries. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepares you for standing here in the exact place where it all unraveled. 9 hikers, young, bright, full of hope, set out on an expedition to conquer the Kolatsiakl, the Mountain of the Dead. They were experts, prepared for every scenario. But something went horribly wrong. Their tent was found slashed from the inside, belongings left behind as if they had fled in sheer terror. Bodies were scattered across the snow, some nearly naked, others with gruesome injuries no natural force could fully explain. I've been obsessed with this mystery for years. Theories run wild. Avalanches, military experiments, infrasound, even extraterrestrial involvement. But theories are easy to debate from the safety of a warm room. Out here, under this bleak sky, surrounded by the endless white, theories feel hollow. I had to see it for myself. I had to stand here to retrace their steps, to understand what could have driven 9 people into the freezing night, shoeless and frantic. But let me tell you something. Nothing could have prepared me for what I felt, what I heard, when I camped here overnight. I'll get to that. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, back to January 1959, when 9 hikers started a journey they would never return from. If you're drawn to mysteries like this one, if you crave answers to the stories that refuse to fade, make sure to subscribe, because some stories deserve to be told, and some answers might just be waiting in the snow. The Dyatlov Pass Incident didn't begin with mystery, it began with hope. 9 hikers, led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, set out on what should have been an exhilarating winter expedition through the Ural Mountains. Igor wasn't just their leader, he was the glue holding the team together. Calm, focused, and highly skilled, he had a way of making everyone feel safe, even when things got tough. The team was a mix of bright, driven young people, each with their own story. Zinaida Kolmogorova, lively and strong-willed, had hiked with Igor before and was known for her adventurous spirit. Yuri Doroshenko, fiercely brave, once chased a bear away from a campsite with nothing but a stick. There was Lyudmila Dubinina, a passionate and headstrong hiker, and Rustem Slobodin, quiet but dependable. Then there was Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Yuri Krivonishenko, each bringing their own expertise and personality to the group. And finally, Yuri Yudin, the 10th member, who would later consider himself both lucky and cursed. Lucky because illness forced him to turn back early in the journey, and cursed because he would carry the guilt of surviving for the rest of his life. Their goal was to reach Otorten Mountain, a challenging but manageable trek for such an experienced team. But to get there, they had to pass through Kolatsiakl, a name that roughly translates to the Mountain of the Dead. The name alone feels like foreshadowing, doesn't it? But to them, it was just a name, an old legend from the indigenous Mansi people. Their journey began on January 23, 1959, full of laughter, songs, and the camaraderie that forms between people braving the wilderness together. The team documented everything: diary entries, photos, even playful poses in front of the camera. There's something eerie about looking at those final photos now. Smiling faces, warm scarves wrapped tightly around their necks, and behind them, endless snow and sky. One of the diary entries stands out to me. It was written by Lyudmila Dubinina. It's hard to explain, but I feel uneasy tonight. The wind sounds different. It's as if the mountain is speaking. I'm sure it's just the cold playing tricks on me. Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow was never better. The deeper they went into the wilderness, the more isolated they became. The snow grew thicker, the winds sharper, and temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, their small tent must have felt like the only sanctuary in an endless white void. Imagine that for a moment. 9 people huddled together, their breaths freezing in the air, the silence so loud it presses against your ears. And out there, just beyond the thin fabric walls of their tent, the yawning emptiness of the mountains stretches on forever. It's not hard to imagine how the isolation might have begun to sink in, how the weight of it pressed on their minds. But they were experienced hikers. They would have been used to the cold, the quiet, the endless white. And yet, something changed. On February 1st, the group set up their final camp on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. For reasons still unknown, they chose an exposed spot on the mountainside instead of taking shelter in the nearby tree line. Some speculate they wanted to test themselves, others believe they may have lost their way as daylight faded. Whatever the reason, that tent, half buried in snow, slashed open from the inside, would become the center of one of history's most baffling, unsolved mysteries. If you were in their place, surrounded by miles of empty snow and an unrelenting cold pressing in from every side, would you have pushed forward into the icy unknown or turned back while you still could? For weeks, the hikers' absence gnawed at their families and friends. No word, no radio transmissions, no sign of their return. At first, authorities were hesitant to sound the alarm. Experienced hikers often faced delays due to weather or unforeseen challenges. But as days stretched into weeks, the silence became unbearable. By February 20th, 1959, a search party was officially dispatched. It wasn't an easy operation. The Ural Mountains in February are unforgiving, and every step into the frozen expanse felt like walking into a graveyard of snow and shadows. The rescue team was made up of volunteers, students, military personnel, and even some locals from the indigenous Mansi tribes. The hikers' planned route had been mapped out in advance, and searchers began retracing their steps, following faint clues left in the snow. Days of scouring the landscape yielded nothing but white emptiness, until February 26th, when they stumbled upon something partially buried in the snow. It was the 10th, half collapsed, partially covered in frost and snowdrifts, but still identifiable. The search team approached cautiously, hearts pounding in their chests. Something was wrong. The tent was slashed open from the inside. Not a tear from external forces, no bear attack, no avalanche force. The fabric had been cut open by hands that desperately needed to escape. The hikers' belongings were still inside. Boots, heavy coats, food supplies, even personal journals and cameras. None of it had been taken or disturbed. Scattered footprints led away from the tent in the snow, preserved by the icy temperatures. Some prints were made by bare feet, others by socks, and a few showed thin, inadequate footwear for such extreme conditions. But the strangest part, the footprints showed no signs of panic. They weren't wild, frantic dashes into the night. They were deliberate, orderly steps, as though the group had walked calmly into the freezing darkness. At that moment, one thing was clear. Whatever drove them out of the tent had been more terrifying than the deadly cold waiting for them outside. The footprints led the search team downhill toward the edge of a nearby forest. At the tree line, the rescuers made their first grim discovery. 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, lay side by side beneath a large cedar tree. They were barely dressed, wearing only underwear and thin shirts, their feet bare against the frozen ground. Their hands were covered in burns, and the branches above them were broken as if they had tried to climb the tree in desperation. Small pieces of bark and splinters were found embedded under their fingernails. Nearby, a faint trace of a makeshift fire remained, but it was long extinguished. These two men had fought for their lives in the biting cold, their final moments spent in agony and confusion. A few hundred meters away, Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader, was found lying face up in the snow. One arm was stretched out, as though reaching for something or someone. He was better dressed than the first two bodies, but still far from adequately protected against the cold. Not far from him, Rustem Slobodin was discovered face down in the snow. His skull had a visible crack, but strangely the injury wasn't considered fatal. Zinaida Kolmogorova was also found nearby. Her face was frozen in an expression of terror, her hands clenched tightly around the fabric of her coat as if she had been trying to shield herself from something unspeakable. It took rescuers months to find the remaining four bodies. They were discovered in a small ravine, buried under several feet of snow. These final victims, Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Alexander Kolevatov, and Semyon Zolotaryov, painted an even grimmer picture. Lyudmila was missing her tongue and eyes. Semyon and Nikolai had suffered massive chest fractures, injuries so severe they were described as being comparable to those sustained in high-speed car crashes. And yet, there were no external wounds, no bruising, no cuts, just internal devastation. Theories erupted instantly. What force could crush human bodies with such precision without leaving a single mark on the outside? The investigation was chaotic from the start. Soviet authorities were under immense pressure to explain the incident, but every piece of evidence seemed to contradict the last. One theory was that an avalanche had struck the tent, causing the group to panic and flee into the night. But the slope was too shallow for a significant avalanche, and no snow debris consistent with one was found. Another theory proposed paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where hypothermic victims remove their clothing due to nerve damage, tricking their brains into feeling overheated. But that didn't explain the severe injuries, the missing tongue, or the orderly footprints. Some whispered about Soviet military tests, parachute mines, or secret radiation experiments. Strangely, traces of radiation were found on the hikers' clothing, but if that were the case, why cover it up so haphazardly? And then there were the lights in the sky. Other hikers and locals in the area reported seeing strange glowing orbs hovering over the mountains during the same time period. Could it have been something not of this world? Every theory raised more questions. Every answer unraveled into more confusion. The official Soviet report concluded that the hikers had died due to a compelling natural force. What that force was remains open to speculation. But here's the thing. Whatever happened on that mountain, it was enough to drive 9 experienced hikers into the freezing wilderness without their shoes, without their jackets, without a shred of logical survival instinct. The scene left behind in the snow, broken branches, silent footprints, crushed bones, feels less like an accident and more like a message that no one has been able to decipher. I've always been drawn to stories that don't have answers, puzzles left half-finished, endings that hang in the air like frost on a winter branch. The Dyatlov Pass Incident was one of those stories. I'd read every theory, studied every photo, and memorized every diary entry. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed to feel it, to stand where they stood, to breathe the same thin, frozen air. It took months of preparation. Permits, cold weather training, survival gear. Every detail had to be accounted for. Even then, there were people who told me not to go. That place isn't meant for visitors, one local had said. The mountain doesn't forget. But I went anyway. The journey began at the same starting point the Dyatlov group had set out from, the small town of Ivdel. From there, I traveled deeper into the wilderness, following their route as precisely as I could. At first, the trail was familiar, forests dusted with snow, rivers frozen mid-flow. But as I moved further, the world started to change. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Real silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's a presence in itself, a weight pressing against your ears, Occasionally, the wind would break it, howling through the trees like a distant scream. The second thing was the isolation. Days passed without seeing another human face. The forests grew sparser, the trees thinning out until they gave way to endless fields of snow and stone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by an animal or another person, but by the mountain itself. After days of hiking and carefully rationing my supplies, I reached Kolatsiakl, the mountain of the dead. The weight of its name hit differently when you're standing on its frozen slopes, with nothing but an empty sky stretching out above you. It was late afternoon when I set up camp near the same spot where the Dyatlov group had pitched their tent. The light was fading fast, the sun dipping below the jagged horizon, casting everything in shades of blue and grey. As night fell, the cold became unbearable. Even inside my tent, wrapped in layers of insulated clothing and thick sleeping bags, I could feel the frost seeping into my skin. The wind outside seemed alive, clawing at the fabric of my tent, whispering things I couldn't quite make out. I turned off my flashlight to conserve batteries. That's when I realized how dark it was. Pure, absolute darkness. There was no moon that night, no stars visible through the heavy clouds. It was like being buried alive under an ocean of ink. The silence outside grew heavy again, pressing against my ears. And then I heard it. Crunch. Footsteps in the snow. They were faint, deliberate, and close. Too close. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my throat as I strained to listen. The steps stopped, then started again, circling the tent, slowly, methodically. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, but there was nothing, just an endless expanse of white under the faint glow of my flashlight beam. The snow was undisturbed, no tracks, no movement, and yet I knew I wasn't alone. I zipped the tent shut again, my breath fogging up the air inside. I told myself it was the wind, the shifting snow, anything but what it felt like. But deep down, I knew better. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the tent fabric, every distant moan of the wind felt like a warning. At one point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start to an overwhelming silence. Even the wind had stopped. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A faint glow on the horizon. Soft, bluish light hovering just above the tree line. It flickered gently, almost like it was alive. I scrambled out of the tent, my boots crunching against the snow as I squinted into the darkness. The light was still there, faint but unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't fade. It just was. I wanted to move closer, to see it properly, but something deep in my gut held me back. I stood there, frozen, not by the cold, but by something else, something instinctual. Eventually the light faded, swallowed by the endless dark. I stumbled back into my tent and sat there, staring at nothing, clutching my flashlight like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The next morning, the landscape felt different, colder, heavier. I considered packing up and leaving. Whatever curiosity had driven me here was starting to feel like a trap, like bait left in the snow for something hungry to find. But then I thought about the Dyatlov group. They must have felt the same fear, the same gnawing sense that they were somewhere they didn't belong. And yet they stayed. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Instead, I spent the day carefully retracing their final steps. I visited the cedar tree where Yuri and Yuri had been found. I stared at the hollow spot in the snow where Igor Dyatlov had lain face up in the freezing wind. The forest felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, and every sound seemed muffled. At one point, I swear I heard faint whispers carried on the wind, words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in voices that didn't sound entirely human. That night, back at my tent, the same pattern repeated itself. Footsteps, silence, and again the faint blue glow in the distance. But this time, It felt closer. I had a choice to make: stay and see this through, or leave and accept that some questions might never have answers. What would you have done? Would you have stayed through the night, waiting for whatever was out there to show itself? Or would you have packed up and fled the moment something felt wrong? I stayed. Somehow, despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I stayed. I don't know what I was expecting. Some grand revelation, some ghostly figure emerging from the shadows with answers. But the truth is, the mountain doesn't give answers. It only leaves you with silence, with shadows, and with the crushing weight of not knowing. When the sun rose on the third day, I packed my things and started my long journey back down the slope of Syakhl. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, not by footsteps or shadows, but by something else. Something that still lingers on that mountain, waiting for anyone foolish enough to look for it. The Dyatlov Pass Incident has become one of the most perplexing mysteries of the 20th century. In the decades since that final chaotic night on Syakhl, countless theories have been proposed, each attempting to explain the bizarre and chilling details left behind in the snow. But every theory, no matter how logical or wild, seems to leave one question unanswered. Let me walk you through the most debated explanations, and then I'll tell you what I believe. This is one of the most widely accepted theories, and on the surface it seems plausible. The idea is simple. A small avalanche struck their tent in the dead of night. It wasn't large enough to bury them completely, but it was powerful enough to panic the group. They slashed their way out of the tent and fled into the freezing dark, disoriented and unable to find their way back. The injuries found on some of the hikers, like Lyudmila Dubinina's crushed ribs and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol's fractured skull, could theoretically have been caused by the force of heavy snow. But here's the problem. The area where the tent was found doesn't show clear signs of avalanche activity. The slope of the mountain is far too shallow for a significant avalanche to occur. Even more baffling, there was no evidence of compacted snow or avalanche debris around the tent. And why would experienced hikers, people who knew the mountains, set up camp in a spot prone to avalanches in the first place? It doesn't add up. It explains some of the injuries, but not the strange behaviors, the slashed tent, or the orderly footprints leading away into the snow. This theory feels straight out of a psychological thriller, but it's rooted in science. Infrasound refers to sound waves below the range of human hearing, often created by natural phenomena like wind passing over certain mountain shapes or weather systems. Under the right conditions, these low-frequency vibrations can cause feelings of panic, nausea, hallucinations, and even overwhelming dread. Some researchers suggest that an unusual weather pattern might have created these sound waves on that fateful night, triggering a collective panic attack among the hikers. This could explain why the group suddenly abandoned their tent, seemingly in a state of controlled but irrational fear. They may have believed they were escaping an unseen danger, their judgment clouded by something they couldn't hear but could feel. But then we return to the injuries, devastating internal trauma without external damage. Could infrasound cause that? Number. And what about the burns on the hiker's hands or the missing eyes and tongue? Infrasound might account for the initial panic, but it doesn't explain everything else. The Soviet Union in the late 1950s was a place of secrecy, rapid militarization, and experimental weapons testing. Some researchers believe the hikers may have stumbled into a classified military test zone, unknowingly becoming collateral damage in an operation gone horribly wrong. One theory suggests parachute mines were being tested in the area, devices designed to explode above ground, creating powerful shockwaves that could cause internal injuries similar to those found on the hikers. This might explain the strange crushing injuries without external wounds. There were also faint traces of radiation found on some of the hikers' clothing, another unsettling clue that points toward military activity. But if this were true, why leave the tent and bodies behind in such a bizarre, exposed state? And wouldn't there have been some effort to cover up the evidence entirely? It's possible the Soviet government knew more than they let on. Possible that some pieces of this puzzle were quietly swept under the rug. But if this was a military accident, it was covered up in such a sloppy, fragmented way that it only raised more questions. Now we arrive at the strangest and perhaps most chilling theory of all. In the weeks following the incident, other hikers and locals reported seeing strange lights in the sky near the Dyatlov Pass. Glowing orbs hovering silently above the mountains, pulsing with an unnatural light. Could the group have encountered something not of this world? The missing tongue, the burned hands, the look of sheer terror frozen onto some of the hikers' faces. It all feels like something pulled from a nightmare. There are even whispers among the indigenous Mansi people about cursed places in the mountains, places where spirits linger, where humans aren't meant to tread. Did the hikers stumble upon one of these places? Did they see something they weren't supposed to see? It's easy to dismiss these ideas as folklore or paranoia. But when you're standing alone on that mountainside, with the wind howling and the shadows stretching across the snow, you start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there's something out there. After everything I've read, after retracing their steps, after standing in the same frozen silence where they met their end, here's what I believe. I think it wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just an avalanche. It wasn't just infrasound. It wasn't just military testing or something paranormal. It might have been a terrible combination of circumstances colliding in the worst possible way. Maybe the group heard something, felt something that night. Maybe infrasound created a wave of panic. Maybe they stumbled into a military zone and were caught in the blast radius of something they shouldn't have seen. Maybe they did see those lights in the sky and realized they were utterly, horribly alone. I don't know. But here's the thing about the Dyatlov Pass. It doesn't give answers. It only gives more silence. When I stood there on that frozen slope, I felt something heavy, something oppressive. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was more like a presence, like the mountain itself was alive, and it was watching me. I think whatever happened to the Dyatlov group, it's something we're not meant to understand. Some mysteries are meant to stay buried in the snow. The thing about trying to reconstruct that final night on Kholat Syakhl is that every theory feels like trying to patch a hole in a sinking boat. We have fragments, footprints, injuries, diary entries, but the truth slipped away into the snowstorm long ago. Still, I'll do my best to piece together what I believe happened. It was February 1st, 1959, and night had fallen over the Ural mountains. The hikers had set up camp on the exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl. It was an odd choice. Just a mile downhill was the shelter of the tree line, a natural windbreak that would have shielded them from the worst of the cold. But for some reason, they stayed. Maybe they were too tired to keep walking. Maybe they wanted to prove something to themselves, to conquer the mountain without taking shortcuts. Whatever the reason, they pitched their tent on that barren, icy slope, dug themselves into the snow for insulation, and huddled together against the cold. From their diaries, we know they were still in good spirits. There's an entry from Igor Dyatlov where he jokes about how cramped the tent was, how someone kept elbowing him in their sleep, but at some point in the night, something changed. Something drove 9 experienced hikers, people who knew the dangers of the cold, who knew better than to run into the night without their boots or coats, to slash open their tent from the inside and flee into the snow. Theories vary, but I think it started with a sound. A distant rumble, a vibration deep in the ground, or maybe a faint whistling that made their skin crawl. Or maybe it was the lights. Reports of glowing orbs hovering over the mountains weren't just confined to folklore. They were documented by witnesses, even by military personnel. What if the hikers saw them too? What if they stared out into the night and saw something they couldn't understand? Something that made them forget the cold, forget survival, and just run. Imagine the scene. 9 people tangled in sleeping bags and layers of clothing, waking to something outside or maybe inside their minds screaming at them to flee. Hands shaking as they grab for knives, slashing through the tent fabric in a blind panic. Outside, the wind is howling, the temperature is below freezing, and the snow beneath their bare feet burns like fire. But still, they keep moving, stumbling downhill toward the tree line. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko are the first to reach the cedar tree. Desperate for warmth, they claw at the branches, their bare hands splintering as they try to start a fire. Their final moments are spent in agony, their fingers charred from the faint embers of their makeshift fire. Igor Dyatlov tries to turn back. Maybe he realizes the group is scattered, or maybe he's trying to make sense of what happened. But he collapses in the snow, one arm outstretched as if reaching for something, or someone. Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustem Slobodin fall not far from him. Rustem's head injury suggests he fell hard. Zinaida's frozen expression, the way her hands clutch her coat, speaks of a terror so overwhelming it followed her into death. And then there are the final 4: Lyudmila Dubinina, Nikolai Thibaut Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Alexander Kolevatov. They make it further into the ravine, where they try to build shelter in a desperate attempt to survive. But their injuries, crushed ribs, fractured skulls, and the unsettling detail of Lyudmila's missing tongue and eyes suggest something violent, something impossible happened in those final moments. Whatever drove them from the tent followed them to the ravine. And whatever happened there left no witnesses. When I stood at the spot where their tent was found, when I followed their footprints down to the cedar tree and finally into that ravine, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain was still watching. But there's something I haven't told you yet. During my investigation, I came across something buried under the snow near the tree line. It wasn't in the official reports, and I've never seen it mentioned in any documents or interviews. It was a fragment of fabric wedged between 2 branches, small like a piece torn from clothing, but it wasn't from the hiker's gear. It was too smooth, too synthetic, and stitched into it, barely legible beneath a layer of frost and dirt, was a single word: caution. It didn't look like anything the hikers would have carried, and it didn't match anything documented from military equipment of the time. I don't know what it means. Maybe it was part of an old weather balloon or debris from a long-forgotten experiment, or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that when I found it, I felt cold, a different kind of cold, not physical, but deep in my chest, like something heavy was pressing against me. I took a photo of it, but the image came out distorted, warped by static, like an old TV screen struggling to hold a signal. I buried it back where I found it. Some things are better left undisturbed. I can't tell you exactly what happened on the final night of the Dyatlov Pass incident. I can't promise you answers, because the truth isn't something you can hold in your hands. But I will tell you this: something happened. Something violent. Something strange. Something that made 9 people flee into the frozen dark, barefoot and terrified. Whether it was the earth trembling beneath them, a sound vibrating deep in their skulls, the glow of something inhuman on the horizon, or the heavy silence of a curse older than any of us, I don't know. But standing there, on that mountainside, I realized something. The mountain doesn't care about your questions. It doesn't care about your theories or your need for closure. The mountain remembers, and if you listen closely, if you stand there long enough in the biting cold and the oppressive silence, you might hear it whispering its secrets, but you might not like what you hear. Some stories follow you home. They linger in the corners of your mind, creeping in during quiet moments when you think you're alone. The Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those stories. After everything I've seen, after walking the same paths those 9 hikers walked, after standing where their tent once stood, I've realized something. There are places in this world where answers simply don't exist. The Ural mountains are vast, cold and utterly indifferent to human curiosity. Kolat Shachal doesn't care about our questions or our theories. It doesn't care about closure. It stands there, silent and unyielding, keeping its secrets buried beneath layers of ice and time. The hiker's tent is long gone, their bodies buried, their story frozen in photographs and scattered notes. But the weight of their final night hangs heavy over that place. You can feel it. It presses down on you like the thick, freezing air. Theories will continue to surface, some scientific, some wild, some whispered with fear late at night. Was it an avalanche, infrasound, military experiments? Or was it something stranger, something we're not meant to understand? I don't know. And the truth is, I don't think anyone ever will. But maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to have answers. Maybe some places aren't meant to be disturbed. When I left the pass, I looked back one last time. The wind was still howling, the snow was still falling, and the mountain was still watching. And in that moment, I realized whatever happened on that night in 1959, it's still happening. Not in a physical sense, but in the way the story grips us, refusing to let go. There's a piece of each of us up there on that frozen slope, a quiet, haunting reminder of just how small we are against the vastness of the unknown. And maybe that's why this story stays with us. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, and some answers are better left unknown. But I'll leave you with this. What do you think happened to those 9 hikers? Was it something natural, something man-made, or something beyond explanation? Leave your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And if this story kept you on edge, if it sent chills down your spine, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are more chilling tales waiting to be told. But for now, the mountain remains silent. The sound of the wind rises softly one final time, carrying faint whispers before fading into complete silence.